the unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma.
The unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma
is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas.
Is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas.
Now I can see and hear it.
Now I can see and hear it.
Accept and maintain it.
Accept and maintain it.
May I unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's truth.
May I unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's truth.
Morning.
Morning.
I have a lot of thoughts, and I don't know how to sequence them. I tend to not plan because I find that it stresses me out. So I'm going to rip off one of my teachers right now, which is most of what I do. The teachers, Buddhist teachers are kind of like DJs doing mashups all the time. You're figuring out what new song you want to make out of all the songs that came before. So it's all samples. But so I'm ripping this off of Mingyur Rinpoche. I want to cite my sources here. Mingyur Rinpoche, who's after I got Dharma transmission in the Zen tradition, I started studying with a Tibetan teacher named Yongyi Mingyur Rinpoche, and he's my boss now. I work for him. So can you see my hand? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's awareness. This is awareness, and you can see my hand. Close your eyes. Okay. Now can you see my hand? Mm-hmm. That's also awareness. Yeah. So awareness is the apprehension of objects and the apprehension of non-apprehension of objects. So in Buddhism, what we call mind is that which is clear and knowing. The qualities of mind are emptiness and luminosity. Because in order to be able to apprehend anything, it can't be holding on to anything. Like if you had, when you go to, I haven't been in a bar in a long time, but when I used to go to bars and the kinds of bars that I went to, there would be graffiti all over the mirrors. And when there's graffiti all over the mirror is holding on to an object so it can't reflect properly. The mind isn't like that. The mind doesn't have graffiti on it, The mind is reflecting. It is that which is clear. So that's why we call it, as a quality of emptiness, it has a quality of luminosity, because that's the potentiality of reflecting all the time. The awareness is not something you can create or generate or muster or make happen more. So sometimes we say, oh, well, I lacked awareness. You're never lacking awareness. There's never been, I was thinking when we were doing the opening chant, the profound Dharma, the unsurpassed profound Dharma is rarely met with. It's actually never not met with. There's a bit of a fib there. It's never not met with. There's not a moment where you're not meeting the unsurpassed, profound, and wondrous Dharma. But what we're capable of is non-recognition. So our goal is to not bring anything into existence, but it's to recognize what's in existence. How do you recognize what's in existence? It's a very short journey. It's a very short trip. And the less effort, the better, because it's actually doing it uninterruptedly all the time. So all you have to actually do is nothing. So the bone that I have to pick with the way that a lot of people in the Euro-American world are doing meditation-oriented Buddhism is that really view it as kind of this like individual's hero's journey kind of thing. That I'm purifying or overcoming certain kind of problematic aspects of myself so that I can become some kind of better thing. You know? And I said this yesterday, if this were a reggae song, we would call that Babylon System. You know, Babylon System's a placeholder in like reggae songs for everything that's oppressive bullshit that you've been told or that you're living under, you know? And it's interesting because of all of the different practices that existed in Buddhist Asia, the ones that the kind of early generations of like Euro-American whites got excited about were all of these kind of ones that kind of dovetailed well with this kind of individual self-improvement kind of regimen, you know? Because the kind of fable of the individual is what keeps our kind of economic situation moving in the way that it does. You know, like only you can prevent forest fires. You know, only me? Only I can prevent forest fires? You know, so right there's all of these lies that we're told. You know, you have, I don't know how, like, something like less than 10 corporations are responsible for like 80% of the world's carbon emissions. And then you're stressing out about whether you're, you know, how much you're driving and what your gas mileage is and stuff like that. All this blame is put on the individual. You know, like it's you. If you're not recycling, you're actually destroying the planet. It's like, am I? You know, me? Only I can prevent forest fires? You know, so there's this idea that the way that Buddhism's practiced in the Euro-American world that corroborates a lot of the biases that the deciders, that the stakeholders in our economic situation, that the stakeholders in our oppressive, like powered down situation have like imputed into, you know, that we've internalized. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase that, you know. That your liberation is an individual situation. You know, it's funny because sometimes you hear this phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The origins of that phrase is that it's a joke about something that you couldn't possibly ever do. You know, and it's used as this thing that like, I'm a self-made person. You know, there has never been a self-made person. Everybody is perfectly suspended in the situation that they are by innumerable causes and conditions that were outside of their control. All of your fortunes and your misfortunes are not things that you've done. You know? Now, we've inherited things to work with, and they're our responsibility. They're not our fault, but they're our responsibility. You know? And giving a shit about what other people around you inherited so that you can move into the world that you want to be in together is something that, if you have the space to consider, is a great thing to consider. Because a liberated community creates a liberated world. Liberated individuals kind of worthless. So, if we're sitting around with this thought, I'm not good enough. You know, there's no part of that sense, no particle of that sense makes any sense at all. First of all, I is a bit of a hoax. You know, not. What am I not? You know, there's the I that doesn't exist, which is what we think of all the time. There's the I that does exist, which is never changing continuum of a collection of body and mind. Yeah. So the I that does exist is the I that is nothing but potentiality. The thing that we're calling I all the time is this lump of potentiality. So to say I'm not, that's not quite it. You know, because I am anything potentially. Good? I don't know. What does good mean? Good for who? Good for what? You know, compared to what? You know, if you're comparing yourself to something that you have imagined, sure. You know, if you're comparing ourselves to some kind of situation that doesn't exist, we're always going to lose. You know, and sometimes religion is inviting us into that, comparing yourself to something that no one's ever really even seen before. So guess what? You're going to come up short all the time. Yeah. If you imagine that the Buddha was this being that had actually absolutely zero stress and zero vexation, and you're saying, well, I'm not quite there, you're always going to not quite be there. And in the early teaching, Buddha was not a person that was free of all stress and vexation. There's stories in the Pali Canon or in the early Buddhist tradition, there'd be two monks arguing and he would come across them and he'd try to deal with it for a little while, and there's a story where he goes, you know what, I can't with you guys. You know, yeah. There's this idea in the early tradition that the nirvana that Buddha experienced under the Bodhi tree when he was 30-something years old, they call it nirvana with remainder. What's the remainder? The fuel for the flame of dis-ease is still present, because the fuel for the flame of dis-ease is having a body and mind and being in the world. You know, so it's like if you blew out that candle, sure, the flame's gone, but all of the conditions for the flame to exist are still there. You know, and if something comes along, it can ignite. You know, I've known people that have lost half a barn because they had a pile of greasy rags. You know, it can combust. You don't even have to put a match to it. The causes and conditions will come along, and if that fuel's still there, it'll combust. And the fuel is having a body and mind and existing in this world. So if you're comparing yourself to some idea of this kind of perfect Buddha, you can give up the ghost right now. Even Buddha wasn't the perfect Buddha, according to the early tradition. Now, the way religions develop, there's a story that they have to tell about themselves so they can, you know, get your support. And perfection sells, you know, and perfection, comparing yourself to perfection. If you're selling perfection, it's an unquenchable thirst, so it can keep people coming back, you know, but it's not the proposition. The proposition is recognizing the wholeness that you got the moment you came into existence. You know, the phrase I had an interaction yesterday that helped me coin this kind of way of talking about it. And it's just like, the bill has been paid. The ticket is settled. You know, your meal, the buffet that you've got the next however many years to sit up at, the bill's been settled. All you have to do is partake in it. You don't have to earn your existence. It's been paid for. You got it. You're here. You know, there's nothing you have to do to demonstrate to anybody that you deserve to be here and that you deserve to be having an okay time. Yeah. And there's nothing you can do to make your time here perfect. So if you think that not having a perfect time is an indicator of some kind of deficit on your end, that's Babylon's system. That's a hoax. You know, it's not your fault when you don't have a nice time. But what can we do about it? So there's this thought with religions, when another way that religions kind of market themselves, you know, is probably the earliest product that's ever been marketed has been religion. The way religions market themselves is like, well, if this is really true, it has to be true universally throughout all space and time. So if you take the truth of your salvation through samadhi or something like that, and put that on another universe, it's got to be true over there, because it's got to be all across the board universally true. But that doesn't take into consideration the real teaching of cause and effect, that this is a particular, our human situation on this earth is a unique and particular situation. You know, so these teachings are actually for us here right now, you know, and they arose in a certain place and time in response to a certain situation. You know, it's really comes from a 29-year-old going, why does life feel this way? You know, why does life feel this way? And decided to investigate that and decided to share what he discovered. You know, and whatever he discovered was uniquely so potent that it's been elaborated upon, expounded upon, diversified, and carried out, you know, really covered a whole continent and has been exported for 2,500 years. But it's a unique response to the situation that we find ourselves in. You know, what's the point of that? Why do I say that? So I was in a car ride the other day, and I was with my partner. My partner is also a priest. And we were leaving this fundraising event that was a 30-hour sit-a-thon at the Clouds and Water Zen Center. That's where I primarily teach and exist. Clouds and Water Zen Center in St. Paul, Minnesota. We had this 30-hour sit-a-thon, and I cooked for it. And a bunch of us like spent the night there and stuff, and there was a lot of conversation. It was a neat, kind of unstructured way of being together. So the Zendo is open, but you can come out and hang out and stuff. It kind of reminded me of like a day off at a monastery. Which is the greatest, you know. And we're driving home, and my partner goes, "What do you think what do you think Zen is about compared to like other traditions in Buddhism, you know?" And I'm like, I think the Zen bone to pick, the Zen agenda, is really clarifying the intersection of the relative and the absolute. That's our kind of like focal point, you know. And then the other things of like discipline and development and stuff like that, we call those kind of provisional teachings, you know. Khyentse Rinpoche sometimes says, you know, all of the rules are kind of like the baby food. You know, it's like been pre-blended for easy digestion or something like that. But the gist of it, the meat of it, is this understanding the intersection of the relative and the absolute, how they rely on each other, you know, and how we can understand how they exist together. If you think that the absolute is something that is transcendental and remote from the life that you're living, that ain't quite it. You know, the relative, the particularities of your existence is precisely the texture of the absolute. You know, there's not anything that you can call absolute that exists outside of the particularities of the life that you're experiencing. So what does that have to do with like the practice that we're doing? It's been said, like when you go to a Buddhist teacher or if you read a Buddhist book, it's often said, well, there's two fundamental types of Buddhist meditation. There's shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha is a word for like quiescence of mind, concentration of mind to the point of quiescence and absorption. I guess that's what you could call it. Sometimes they call it calm abiding. The cultivation of, I love this term, meditative equipoise, you know. And then the vipassana is insight. Insight into what? Insight into the three marks of existence. This is impermanence, not self, and ignorance, or dukkha. I would say that saying that there's two basic kinds of Buddhist meditation is a true statement until about 600 AD. And I apologize for everybody that was here yesterday and heard me talk about this already. I would say that's a true statement until about 500-600 AD. Something else developed, you know, because like there's a kind of a Western academic habit of thinking that authenticity lies in the earliest point in history that you can locate. You know? And so you have like for instance, if you wanted to go study yoga academically, they'd be like, well, you have to learn Sanskrit. And it's like, well, there's been like 1,000 years of yogic texts that were written in vernacular languages. You know, but it's like, no, you gotta learn Sanskrit because that's the source, and you can't study something without studying the source of it. It's like, well, what about all these interesting evolutions and developments and responses to people's situations that they've developed? And it's like, well, that wouldn't really be studying religion. That would be studying, you know, anthropology, social anthropology or something like that, you know? Because it's too recent. You know, 800 years is way too recent. Like I have a friend, I have a student that it's like, well, I want to maybe do a master's in Buddhism, so I was thinking of studying Japanese. I'm like, technically, most master's programs in Buddhism don't consider Japanese a canonical language, even though there's been writings in Japanese Buddhism for 1,000 years. Your writings in Japanese, because Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Pali, those are the golden languages because they're old enough, you know? So a lot of times to be considered authentic, you have to really cite how what you're doing is kind of original. You know, so sometimes you hear Zen teachers saying, Shakyamuni Buddha sat zazen under the Bodhi tree. It's like, zazen? He did an East Asian meditation practice in India 2,500 years ago. It's not quite, the way that we approach our practice is not identical to the way that practice was approached in India 2,500 years ago. First of all, East Asia, I think I talked about this last time I talked, East Asian Buddhism doesn't really care too much about rebirth. China was a little bit more this life oriented. So they're not trying to solve the problem of being endlessly reborn. They're trying to solve the problem of why does life feel this way? Which I think for most of us in kind of Euro-American societies, or even kind of all across the globe now, are a little bit more oriented towards that. You know, the kind of this life oriented practice. So as Buddhist thought developed, there was this kind of sentiment of like, how long do I have? And can I see a clock? 11:04. When do I stop? And don't say whenever I want.
11:25.
Okay, great. And is that when Q&A would stop?
Well,
That's like the fun...
let's say 11:20, and then
Okay.
we'll have like 5-10 minutes
Okay.
for Q&A.
Great. All right. What are they talking about? Buddhism?
Buddhism.
Okay, the way that things began to develop, it's kind of like, all right, what are you awakened to? You know, what are you awakened to, and where does it come from? You know, and as Buddhist thought kind of evolved through the course of debate and seeing what other traditions were doing and how they were talking about things and the kinds of results that they were getting, something developed in the after the Mahayana kind of situation evolved. Mahayana situation is about 500 years in. So we're talking about 1st century CE. There's this thing that started to come about that's just kind of like, well, if all of the delusion stuff is kind of adventitious, you know, kind of like unnecessarily layered upon a self that is actually fundamentally free, then why are we regarding ourselves as deluded? Why don't we regard ourselves as fundamentally free? You know, so instead of, so the orientations in certain Mahayana schools stopped being you minus your delusions is awake and started to be you plus nothing is awake. It's a different way of coming at it, a different orientation, you know? So the Zen school is a little bit like you plus nothing is awake. So our meditation method is actually sitting in the plus nothing rather than clarifying how we're deluded and letting go of it, you know? It's not the opposite, but it's just a bit different, you know? So this is what we call, you know, like a Buddha nature teaching, you know? Early Buddhism doesn't give a shit about no Buddha nature. They didn't have any concept of that, you know? And this, so if you learn Buddhism from Mahayana Buddhists, they'll be like, Buddhism teaches that we all have Buddha nature. Buddha did not teach that we all have Buddha nature. You know? But there were the seeds there to eventually make that argument, you know? So, if awareness is present, if the awareness is the river that's making every experience that you have possible, what are we trying to do when we sit? You know, what are we trying to cultivate? What are we trying to make happen? You know, and so Dogen Zenji comes along and does a little bit of wordplay. In the Tendai sect, which Dogen Zenji trained in, the word for shamatha and vipassana was shi for shamatha and kan, which means seeing, for vipassana. Shikan, stopping and seeing. This was the Japanese way of saying shamatha and vipassana. Dogen Zenji trained in that tradition. Once he went to China and learned Zen, in the Saotong sect, the Soto sect, he came back and he said, actually, how about shikan taza? It's a word play. Totally different characters, but the shikan is a very similar pronunciation, same pronunciation as stopping and seeing. But when Dogen Zenji says shikan taza, He means nothing but exactly sitting. Nothing but, that's the plus zero, you plus zero. You know, so it's like, what do? Sit upright and do not calculate at all, because all of the calculation is all of the problems. And just recognize the ever-present awareness. This is not a self-improvement regimen. And the Fukan Zazengi says, the Zazen I speak of is not step-by-step developmental learning meditation. It is simply the Dharma gate of repose and bliss. So, when we sit, we're simply accepting that our tab has already been paid, that our tab is settled, and we're just sitting in the buffet of life. You know, sitting in the buffet of having a body mind and the collage of sensory experience that unfolds. So, another sect that developed around the same time as Dogen Zenji was developing the Soto sect, there were two or three Pure Land schools. Has anyone ever heard of Pure Land Buddhism? It often, when Westerners talk about Pure Land Buddhism, it's like Christianity. You know, you pray and then you get to go to heaven, you know, basically. But when you apply non-dual philosophy to Pure Land Buddhism, you see how greatly, greatly sophisticated it is. Because it is just simply that non-dual, non-calculating aspect of Dogen Zen, and you just take out the sitting. Because even the sitting is kind of calculated, right? Mm-hmm. You know? And it's just like, actually, just accept life as it is with gratitude. And the prayer that you say to accept life as it is with gratitude, Nama Amida Butsu. I give gratitude to the Buddha of infinite light. You know, the moment that you give gratitude to the Buddha of infinite light, Amida means with that limitless light. When the minute you give gratitude to the infinite light, you are in that moment free of hindrance. And my favorite Pure Land teacher was a man named Ippen Shonin. And he founded a sect of Pure Land Buddhism called the Ji sect, which means time sect. And this is I just found this quote by Ippen maybe 2 weeks ago, and it's an excellent, concise criticism that I have of the kind of monastic paradigm. He goes, you involve yourself in an external situation in order to cultivate your mind. So you can think of that as a sesshin, a zendo, a schedule, a monastery, something like that. You involve yourself in an external situation in order to cultivate your mind. When the situation subsides, then you find that nothing has been accomplished. Because it's kind of like never taking the training wheels off and thinking you know how to ride a bike. You know, or being on a merry-go-round and thinking that you've become a horse, an equestrian, you know, or something like that. Because all of the ability that you've developed in a monastic situation was contingent upon that situation. You know, so we call that monastic privilege. You know, and monastic privilege turns over into monastic fragility. You know, just like other types of privilege give rise to fragility. Yeah. So the samadhi that you so proudly developed and cultivated can't withstand the light of the world without that situation. You know, and that's another point. Are we comparing ourselves to the samadhi of monastics? Because unless you have unless you leave your house in the morning with a bowl in your hand, and as soon as you step out the door, there's a row of old ladies on their knees putting food in your bowl, then there's no valid comparison to your life situation and the situation of a monastic. You know. So, Ippen Shonin, you involve yourself in an external situation in order to cultivate your mind. When the situation subsides, then you find that nothing has been accomplished. I lived at a monastery for 10 years, I had a lot of great experiences. I saw the leaves glimmer and shit. I got really good at doing all of the ceremonial stuff, you know. I do really pretty bows. I do really beautiful oryoki. The way you should see me take my setsu out and put it between my second and third ball. It's just like ballet, you know. And it turns out when I left the monastery, I found myself in dive bars every goddamn day, you know, watching Weekend at Bernie's on mute and listening to Jim Croce, you know, because everything that made me who I was gone. And I didn't have integrity in my bones, you know. So my teacher always used to say, the best practice is the one that you can do. You know, so start with where you're at and figure out what you need for your life and what suits your life situation. You know, instead of beating yourself up for comparing yourself to some kind of ideal that's not even in the cards. You know. And so he goes on, such practice is good, performed in the attachment to self of self-power. You know, and it's just kind of like this idea that I'm going to carry myself forward and experience awakening, you know? And so many of us are trying to do that, even though as soon as you spend a little bit of time in Soto Zen, you come across to carry the self forward as delusion. You know, with Dogen Zenji. That myriad things come forth and illuminate the self as awakening. You know? That myriad things come forth, that you're created by everything outside of you, actually. You're suspended in reality by all of the non-you elements. You know? And what we call you is just the potential field where that can land. So Suzuki Roshi would say, it's the swinging, what I call this I is just the swinging door where the breath comes in and out. You know, it's paper thin. You know, and the trip to the liberated mind is the shortest trip you can make, but it's just a matter of having that view go from this to this. Another thing by Ippen, I wanted to, okay. This one can get a little confusing. This has to do with precepts, and we just had a Jukai. You may, establishing an objective situation outside the mind, so this is that phrase again, of believing that your practice is contingent upon a practice container, which is not wrong, but you can't leave the training wheels on forever. It needs to be the lab that you then leave, you know, so you can actually get a feel of it, like a batting cage. You know, Zendo's like a batting cage, but it's not playing baseball. Baseball is everything that happens when you leave the batting cage. You may, establishing an objective situation outside the mind, assume an attitude of desisting from evil and performing good, and in this way pass endless eons as particles. But you will still be incapable of parting from the suffering of birth and death. In every one of the teachings, a person attains emancipation from the suffering of birth and death through entering the extinction of subject and object. And then, since he's a Pure Land person, he says the name with a capital N. So this is the recitation of the name. The name right now is the Dharma that is the oneness of subject and object. So if you're not a Pure Land practitioner and the name doesn't, with a capital N, doesn't mean anything to you, you could say the sitting upright, you know, is the melting, the unification of subject and object. To sit upright in the sense of like, there's no me I'm carrying forward. I'm not selfing in this moment. You know, I'm letting the myriad things come forth. You know, now, so he's kind of saying, don't, a lot of people get caught up on this because he's like, don't go bananas trying to avoid evil and do good, because that's still selfing. Now you could hear that and go like, oh, well then I have carte blanche to do whatever I want. But the caveat here is that when you're sitting in the extinction of subject and object, when you don't have the misapprehension of individual the idea is that individual, the way that we relate to it is a misapprehension. When you're not trying to do things for you, the possibility of harmful activity, it doesn't really enter into the picture. When you look at the 10 precepts, the 10 grave precepts or the 10 prohibitory precepts, all of the common denominator of all that is the mind of acquisition and benefit. All the harmful actions is the mind of acquisition and self-benefit. Self-benefit in this very narrow scope. Scratching the itch kind of self-benefit, not cultivation of wellness self-benefit. Cultivation of holistic freedom of existence kind of self-benefit. So when we talk about beyond good and bad in Buddhism, we're not saying there's no such thing as harm, but we're saying that harm is built upon this misapprehension of the individual carrying itself forward and getting stuff out of the world. To aim at a different type of joy. The joy that happens when you stop mustering me, and just taking your seat at the buffet that's already been paid for. I like to say buffet with a U like that. That's how my dad says it. Buffet. So, and then he goes on. Namo Amida Butsu is simply free in itself of birth and death. So it's like this practice of the unification of subject and object is free in itself. And the moment you do it, there's no, you're, like I say, it's the shortest trip you can make, to the self that isn't selfing. It's right here. It's not a matter of creation, it's a matter of recognition. And he says, in spite of this, you sigh while you utter it, and you think, I wish I can attain liberation. I wish I could attain liberation. This is like eating rice and wondering whether there's some medicine which will help with your hunger. So to think that if you're sitting zazen, being like, I wish I could be liberated from all of these intrusive thoughts or something like that, or all of the vexation that I feel, or the sadness that I feel, or whatever, and it's like, well, actually, the proposition is to just sit here and open that hand, so that all that stuff can climb on and climb off freely, and just let it all unfold, so that when the feeling arises, it's like in the Tibetan tradition they say it's like a thief coming to an empty house. It's. I was talking to someone the other day and they said, how do I not reject the thoughts that I don't like? And I didn't say it at the time because I didn't have time to think about it. What I said was great, but what I thought now that if I could be there again, the first thought would be like, how big is your mind? How big is your mind? If you think your mind is this big and an intrusive thought is this big, then it's taken up a lot of space. But the boundary of your mind is something that you've set up. You've developed. You've created the trammel. Of how big of an enclosure this is. You've put up the fencing of the corral. And so if your mind is limitless. Because, think about it. Where does your mind end? The capacity to know. How big is it? Is it a meter in diameter? Like, what's the sphere? Of the reaches of your mind. It's immaterial. It's boundless. It's pure potentiality. It's emptiness, luminous potentiality. So if a thought arises, who gives a shit? It's like I'm no good is like a speck of dust, and it doesn't stand a chance against the recognition of the luminous nature of mind. It doesn't stand a chance. It's like it's like having Popeyes, and then you can't go to KFC ever again. You know, it's like, who are you kidding, Colonel? You know? Or it's like what I said the other day. It's like you've been eating pasta without Parmesan all your life. You know, they have Parmesan. You're like, holy shit! I didn't know it could do this. You know. So, gosh, what was I talking about?
Popeyes.
Well, no.
Sorry.
The size of the mind.
The size of the mind, yeah. It's just like, so if you find access, if you find the pathway to that part inside yourself that is just clear luminosity, and you know how to, you know, I think of the baseball term like tagging up. If you know how to, you know, touch into that, if you know how to, you know, just take a scoop from that reservoir whenever you like, all of the other stuff that you feel like you're fighting with doesn't stand a chance. You know. But this is not a matter of development. You know, this is a matter of not adding anything and just really letting yourself sink to the bottom of the well of the felt experience of who you are. So this is why, you know, oh gosh, I wasted all of my time. This is why it's not, what was the title of the talk?
Interesting.
Not, what was the second one?
Not
Yeah, this is not accomplishing. It's entrusting. You know, the mind of entrustment, the mind of non-calculation is very close to the mind of liberation. It's right here. You know, you can smell the flowers from the liberation field, which is on the other side of the, you know, you just want to get there, and you want to set up base in the mind of entrustment. You know, there's this in the Indian tradition. There's a non-dual tradition, which can be likened to kind of a meditation-y, zen-y kind of thing. And then there's a bhakti tradition. Has anybody ever heard of bhakti yoga? Bhakti yoga is the yoga of devotion, you know. And when, there's a teacher named Edwin Bryan that I'm rather fond of in the bhakti tradition. And he's kind of a fanatic. You know, they all kind of are, you know. It's a certain type of ecstatic, sure of themselves, boisterous kind of personality that gets into bhakti. But they're like, you know, these non-dualists think that we're missing the boat in our devotion to God. They don't get to experience the love experience, you know, in their kind of philosophical non-dualism kind of thing. You know? And I think that's the wisdom of the Pure Land tradition of expressing gratitude to Amida Buddha for paying the bill the day you were born. You know, it's all set. You've been endowed from the beginning with what you're trying to acquire all along. You know, it's just a matter of arriving into it. You know, and how do you arrive into it? Stop trying to improve your mental and emotional situation with will. You know, and just arrive into the luminosity of mind. You know? Any addict can tell you, the more we try to make things better, you know, the more we try to augment our situation, the more like, I need to add this. I need to add things as they are right now are incomplete. I need to add this thing so that it's okay. You know? And you go further and further and you fare worse and worse and worse, and you make your life harder and harder and harder. And all of Buddhism is really about that addictive mechanism, you know, of improvement, and to just actually awaken to the treasure that's present in the luminous awareness of your mind. So when you sit Zazen, you don't have to muster or create anything. You know, you just have to look at, you know, usually we think, this is my last thing, okay. Usually we think there's like a little person little Planters Peanut Man with a top hat and a monocle, holding a flashlight and shining it out from like 1 inch behind your eyes, and that's how you're seeing things and making decisions. This little person right here, and you're shining and shining and shining, and you're apprehending objects, And in Zazen, it's kind of like taking that light and being like, who's there? Who is shining this light? Where is all of this landing? Where is all of this landing? And then when you look to see, the the do the see the think the want the hate and you're looking at the who's that that's always erring from this side that way? If you turn around, look at the this is what we say, taking the backward step that turns the light inward to illuminate the self. When you illuminate the self instead of objects, what do you find? And you think, oh, I must be doing it wrong because I don't see anything. But you got to go through or you may have read a book and you might know, oh, I already know the answer to this. There's nothing. But it's not enough to conceptually know nothing. You have to actually look so that you see the nothing. Because when you see the nothing, you know that there's nothing, and you know that there's something seeing the nothing. There's the experience of the nothing being seen. So this is the emptiness, luminosity, potentiality of the mind. So, I guess that does it. Does it need a bow on top? I don't think it needs a bow on top. I think we're good. That's great. Okay. I went 10 minutes over for Q&A. So I cheated you. I'm sorry.
Well, we can give people the freedom to leave if they need to leave, and anyone that would like to stay for question and answer can do so.
Why don't we call it adjourned, and I'll stay here, and then if you want to grab a coffee or whatever, and you could come and you can come back. Does that work?
Yeah.
Or am I rewriting? Am I throwing wrenches? Am I throwing more wrenches in the big bag?
I told you that's why we brought you here.
If you didn't throw a wrench into it, you'd be throwing a wrench.
Okay. And that goes for online. Online, if you want to stay, the people are gonna, kind of take a little break, but then I'm not gonna go anywhere. Okay.
I have a quick announcement. Pam showed you is sick today, but she made me promise to remind everyone that there's a work day next Saturday. From 10 to noon. You laugh, but look at that garden outside. It has lots of leaves. So anybody that can spend a couple hours with us next Saturday, that would be very, very appreciated. 10 to noon next Saturday. That is all.
Okay. Oh, we'd sing a song. Right?
Yeah.
Is that what you were gonna say? What were you gonna say?
Well, sometimes we bow out. We can do it informally, I guess.
Oh, like I get up and I do the whole thing? Yeah, let's skip that.
Let's yeah, let's just do it. May this merit extend universally to all, so that we, together with all beings, realize the Buddha way. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom,
Thanks.
So we all return our questions back and have a conversation. And then we'll just inform you.
Okay, no bowing.
I ruined